What if I told you that everything you believed about building warm homes on the frontier is a lie? For many years, settlers spent enormous amounts of effort and clay to completely seal massive log walls. In the harsh conditions of the Rocky Mountains or the Canadian taiga, every crack seemed like a deadly threat. Families constantly searched for the tiniest gaps, trying to plug them with moss, mud, or even animal manure. Everyone's thoughts were focused on how to lock the heat inside and keep the icy wind out. It was a difficult and exhausting battle that was repeated every year before the onset of severe cold. In fact, this familiar strategy of complete sealing didn't always work as expected. But listen to the secret of the old trappers. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how an open gap under the roof made a mountain hunter's cabin much warmer than the most sheltered houses. Are you ready to learn the truth about why thick walls didn't save the pioneers of the frontier from the cold? Settlers arrived on the Great Plains and immediately began building sturdy shelters out of thick tree trunks. Their main goal was to create a completely sealed space without a single opening for drafts. People firmly believed that complete isolation from the outside environment would guarantee the retention of heat from an open hearth. Builders spent weeks gathering suitable, sticky clay along the steep riverbanks. They packed this mixture tightly between the heavy logs of their new rectangular dwellings. The work required great physical effort and was completed before the first serious autumn frost set in. Every centimeter of the wall was carefully checked for the slightest voids or natural irregularities in the wood. Inside such houses, stone stoves were installed or wide-open brick hearths were built. The fire in them was kept burning around the clock, using a huge amount of chopped dry firewood. Wood had to be gathered in staggering quantities, which took up all the daylight hours of every resident of the settlement. The heat from the fire was distributed extremely unevenly inside the completely enclosed and soundproof log square. Near the fire itself, the air became scorching hot, forcing people to press closer to the walls. At the log ceilings, the temperature dropped sharply, creating a stark and very unpleasant physical contrast. A person's back would freeze while their face was literally scorched by the heat from the thick logs burning in the hearth. The airtight walls completely prevented warm air from circulating freely throughout the large room. The heated air simply rose to the solid wooden ceiling and accumulated there as a useless layer. Meanwhile, the lower part of the room remained freezing cold, and the wooden floor was always thoroughly frozen. People had to constantly wear heavy winter clothes even inside their own closed house. Thick smoke from the fire also did not always escape completely through the stone chimney. Some of the black soot settled on the ceiling beams and then slowly drifted down onto belongings. Breathing in such a closed-off space became difficult due to the constant lack of fresh outdoor oxygen.
Well.
In the morning, the settlers woke up in a stuffy and, at the same time, very cold central room. The desire to conserve precious heat resulted in an extremely uncomfortable environment for daily living. The builders tried to solve the problem by further insulating the walls and ceilings. They laid additional layers of dense, dry moss under the roof and covered the attic with a thick layer of earth. These measures made the situation worse, completely blocking the flow of clean, cold air from the winter street. The firewood continued to burn, and the hearth gave off heat, but most of the room remained damp and chilly. Families spent long, dark winters in a constant, exhausting struggle against the creeping night chill. They plugged small cracks with old rags and erected thick screens of coarse fabric around their wooden beds. Sacks of provisions were stored in the corners of the room, creating additional barriers to airflow. Each new day began with the heavy task of chopping wood and long attempts to stoke the stove, which had frozen solid overnight. The hardships of such a life severely drained the settlers' physical strength even before the spring thaw set in. The constant search for and chopping of dry wood became the main task for maintaining a modicum of comfort. The architectural approach of that time completely ignored the basic laws of thermal distribution. People stubbornly repeated old methods without attempting to analyze the true causes of their domestic hardships. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on such enclosed structures, so please share your thoughts in the comments. Do you share the settlers' initial conviction that completely sealing off a dwelling was absolutely necessary? Do you agree that thick, plastered walls do not guarantee reliable protection against severe frosts? Be sure to subscribe to our channel to receive new historical facts about life on the frontier. What if everything you were taught about heat retention became obsolete 200 years ago? The main problem with tightly sealed log houses was not the icy wind, but moisture invisible to the eye. During the daily preparation of hot meals, thick white steam constantly rose from the cast iron pots. This moist steam had no way to escape and accumulated inside the tightly sealed room. Additional moisture was continuously released simply through the natural breathing of people sleeping in the same room. During long, cold evenings, the concentration of water in the stagnant air reached its peak. The air became heavy, damp, and extremely uncomfortable to breathe in for long periods. The log walls began to actively absorb this water, acting like a giant wooden sponge. The damp wood lost its natural insulating properties and began to let the cold seep into the house. At night, tiny droplets of icy condensation formed on the inner surfaces of the thick logs. By morning, these droplets froze, covering the far corners of the dwelling with a thin layer of glistening white frost. The stove did not give its heat to the people, but wasted it on drying these frozen, wet walls. Any wet clothes hung up near the hearth after hard work took an incredibly long time to dry. The water from the fabric simply evaporated into the room's air, increasing the overall dampness of the enclosed space. Leather boots and belts were covered with an unpleasant white film due to the constant lack of ventilation. The feeling of dampness never left the settlers, even when the flames in the stove roared at full strength. The physics of the process were merciless to the people locked in their perfectly mud-plastered huts. Water has a high heat capacity, so damp air requires a huge amount of firewood to heat. In a dry room, the temperature rises several times faster with the same amount of wood. The pioneers of the Great Plains did not understand this principle and continued to cut down more and more trees. The damp cold penetrated to the bone much more intensely than the dry frost on the open, windy plateau. The settlers' clothes constantly remained slightly damp to the touch, drawing heat from their own bodies. The corners of the cabin gradually darkened, and a corrosive mold began to grow there. It was impossible to rid the wood of this scourge without thoroughly ventilating the entire log structure. Warm, humid air always rises toward the wooden ceiling. There it collided with the frozen roof boards and instantly cooled, condensing into heavy dew. This dew dripped back onto the earthen or plank floor, completing an endless cycle of dampness. The dwelling turned into a kind of cold steam room, where the heat from the hearth battled against the water falling from above. The settlers tried to heat stones and place them in the corners to raise the temperature locally. These red-hot cobblestones quickly cooled in the damp environment, releasing their energy into the heavy air. No tricks helped to get rid of the piercing sensation of icy dampness during the night. The problem lay in the very architecture of the house, which lacked any means of venting stale air. Frontier homes resembled airtight wooden barrels placed in the middle of an endless snowy plain. The pioneers put in a titanic effort into insulation, which ultimately backfired on them. Nature does not forgive mistakes in understanding the simple principles of air and water movement. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how a lone mountain dweller solved this complex problem of humidity? What you have never seen before was located high in the snow-capped Rocky Mountains of North America. An old, experienced trapper built his winter base far from major settlements and trade routes. His square log cabin stood on a plateau swept by cold winds, surrounded by tall coniferous forests. From the outside, this structure looked completely unfinished and extremely unreliable for the harsh climate. The cabin's owner had deliberately left a wide, open horizontal gap directly beneath the roofline. This large opening stretched along the entire back wall and was not covered from the outside. The frosty mountain wind could freely penetrate the interior through this dark, empty space. The occasional rare travelers considered such an open design a fatal mistake by a careless carpenter. They were genuinely convinced that this man would freeze to death in the very first serious snowstorm. The top log was simply missing, leaving a gap as wide as an adult man's palm. Through this gap, the dark night forest and snowflakes falling on the roof were clearly visible. The trapper didn't even try to patch up the spot with leftover clay or plug it with old hides. Inside his dwelling stood a simple stone hearth, built from smooth river boulders. Next to it was a rough wooden cot and a massive table, hammered together from tree trunks. There were none of the thick layers of felt on the walls or heavy curtains that settlers were accustomed to. The space looked austere, harsh, and completely open to the cold drafts. However, anyone who crossed the threshold of this strange house in the bitter cold was deeply surprised. Inside the hut, there was a dense, even, and very pleasant warmth that enveloped the body from all sides. Nowhere was there any sign of icy condensation, frost on the walls, or dark patches of mold in the corners. The air remained crystal clear, fresh, and incredibly dry, despite the pot boiling on the fire. The owner of the house did not spend all his time chopping and hauling huge stacks of heavy logs. His supply of firewood was surprisingly small compared to the settlers' wood piles on the endless plains. He sat calmly in a single light shirt while a piercing north wind howled outside the window. The hearth burned with an even, steady flame, requiring no constant addition of new fuel. Skeptics couldn't understand why the open hole in the ceiling didn't chill this small room. According to the logic of the plains carpenters, all the heat from the stones should have instantly dissipated into the winter forest. In practice, however, the hut functioned quite differently, shattering all the usual stereotypes about thermal insulation. The open gap served as the primary and most crucial element in the entire structure of this shelter. For years, the hunter had observed how warm air behaved in mountain caves and low-lying areas. He noticed that in shelters with a closed ceiling, the smoke from the fire sank downward and choked people with acrid fumes. At the same time, shelters with a slight draft near the ceiling always remained suitable for long-term habitation. He applied this natural insight to the construction of his wooden house on a rocky plateau. His decision was a bold challenge to all the classical rules of architecture of that harsh era. He preferred a controlled draft to the uncontrolled dampness of fully insulated walls. The result was so impressive that casual visitors began to closely study the design of this ventilation system. Like this video if you too are amazed by the simple yet ingenious ingenuity of these pioneers. The hidden truth, long ignored by the plains carpenters, lay in the strict laws of physics. The gap left by the hunter acted as a powerful natural exhaust valve for all the accumulated moisture. The heated, damp air from the hearth rushed upward and flowed unimpeded outside through the long opening. The room was constantly ridding itself of heavy steam, preventing it from condensing into water on the logs. In place of the departing cloud of moisture, fresh, frosty oxygen was drawn into the hut very slowly. This outdoor air was absolutely dry, as the severe frost had completely frozen the water out of it. As it descended toward the hearth, the dry stream was instantly heated by the red-hot river stones. Then it spread smoothly to the sides, filling every corner of this small wooden house. This continuous process created a constant, gentle circulation of warm air inside the room. There were no sharp temperature barriers in the hut between the cold floor and the scorching ceiling. The space warmed up evenly and efficiently, without requiring a massive amount of energy from the burning firewood. People felt a pleasant, dry warmth on their backs, feet and faces simultaneously, no matter where they were in the room. The strength of the airflow depended on the temperature difference between the inside and outside of the log structure. The colder it was outside the walls, the more actively the hot, humid air sought to leave the room. This natural automatic regulation maintained a perfect climate balance without human intervention. In calm, warm weather, the draft decreased, preventing the hut from getting too cold before nightfall. The width of the gap played a crucial role in the proper functioning of this entire unusual system. If the opening had been located low, it would simply have created a strong, piercing, icy draft at people's feet. Placing it directly under the ceiling ensured that only stale and the lightest steam was vented. Cold air from the street had time to warm up before reaching human height. Smoke from the open stove or hearth also had a steady upward flow. It didn't linger under the beams or descend as a toxic cloud that stung people's eyes. The trapper could cook over an open fire without fear of suffocating in his own home. The ventilation system drew out all combustion products along with excess moisture from the kitchen. The walls of the cabin always remained completely dry and retained their natural honey-colored wood. Dry wood is one of the best insulators created by nature itself. It kept the cold outdoor frost out and reflected the heat from the hearth back into the center of the room. The house functioned like a thermos, constantly refreshing its dry interior. No additional layers of clay could have provided such remarkable thermal comfort. The insulation of lowland homes addressed the consequences of the problem, while ventilation eliminated its cause. The mountain climate dictated its own harsh rules, and survival required an understanding of physical processes. Want to know how this continuous air circulation affected the firewood supply during the longest winter months? The physical properties of air directly affect the rate at which it heats up from any available heat source. Dry outdoor oxygen requires several times less thermal energy to raise its initial temperature. In airtight houses, settlers had to spend a huge amount of firewood to constantly warm up the heavy dampness. The fire gave its maximum power to the invisible water constantly hanging in the space of the enclosed room. A ventilated mountain hut always remained completely filled with light, dry air. The flame of a small hearth easily managed to heat such a space without the slightest extra effort. The temperature inside rose within minutes of lighting a small morning fire with kindling. The wood burned evenly and released all its accumulated heat to the dry environment. The hunter used exactly as many logs for the firebox as were needed to maintain basic comfort. He didn't need to heat the stove stones until they glowed white to dry out the damp, thick logs. The wood pile he had gathered before the first snowfall slowly dwindled over the long winter. He conserved not only the firewood itself, but also a tremendous amount of his own physical energy. Chopping wood in conditions of meter-deep snowdrifts and severe frost was an extremely dangerous and arduous task. The pioneers of the plains were forced to risk their health daily to replenish their dwindling wood supplies. The hunter spared himself this grueling routine by relying on proper circulation of dry air. This freed up his time for repairing equipment, preparing tools, and resting peacefully by the fire. Fuel consumption in such an open hut was reduced by nearly half compared to tightly sealed houses. Every log thrown into the fire provided maximum benefit, warming the body rather than drying out the wet clay. The smoke escaped in a clear stream without clogging the stone chimney with a thick layer of sticky resin and soot. The stove operated with the ideal efficiency available to the technologies of that historical period. The warm stones of the hearth continued to evenly release energy into the dry air, even after the coals had completely died down. Overnight, the temperature in the room dropped very gradually, never reaching critically freezing levels. A sleeping person did not wake up from the intense cold, as happened in freezing, damp houses. In the morning, a few dry branches were enough to instantly restore the house's daytime comfort. Conserving resources was a key factor in survival for lone individuals in the wild, undeveloped wilderness. A trapper could not afford to spend days chopping wood when he needed to traverse mountain trails. The right house design gave him a huge strategic advantage over the harsh natural environment. His experience proved that the quality of the firewood was more important than its total quantity. Understanding this fine line between insulation and necessary ventilation required keen observation. Plains settlers tried to wear nature down, cutting down entire groves to heat their damp shelters. The mountain dweller acted more wisely, using the physics of air currents to save his own labor. The difference in approaches reflected the difference between blind stubbornness and conscious, competent construction. Rumors of an amazing structure that consumed so little firewood slowly trickled down from the high mountains. Hunters and travelers passed these tales on in the settlements at the foot of the snow-capped ridges. The builders of the plains listened to these stories with great skepticism, considering them to be gross exaggerations. Guess what happened next when other carpenters decided to see this unconventional engineering solution with their own eyes? Guess what happened next when the settlers first encountered this unusual construction method? At first, they flatly refused to believe in the effectiveness of the wide gap left right under the roof. They were deeply frightened by the very idea of voluntarily letting cold wind into the living space. Tradition and established norms demanded maximum insulation, and breaking them seemed like madness or foolishness. Visiting pioneers looked in wonder at the dry walls and touched the warm surface of the logs. They expected to see a freezing person, but found the owner in comfortable and very warm conditions. Their eyes saw an open, dark opening under the roof, but their skin felt a soft, even warmth. This stark contradiction forced many to rethink all their previous difficult construction experiences. The harsh realities of the winter months forced the plains dwellers to seek new ways to escape the cold. The stacks of firewood gathered in the fall often ran out before the first signs of the saving spring thaw. Families were frankly freezing in their damp homes, despite constantly loading firewood into the blazing stoves. Stories about the old trapper's warm cabin gradually gained the status of useful practical knowledge. Some farmers went into the mountains specifically to study the width and location of the strange crevice. They measured the ceiling height and the dimensions of the hearth and tried to copy the proportions in their notebooks. What they saw shattered the fundamental principles of construction passed down from fathers to sons over many decades. It turned out that a house must breathe in order to maintain a constant, stable temperature inside. The first tentative attempts to replicate this mountain experiment on the plains met with resistance from the older generation. The elderly colonists cursed and demanded that any holes made in the walls be immediately patched with clay. However, the young carpenters took their axes and purposefully cut out sections of wood beneath their sloped roofs. They risked letting the cold seep into their homes, but their desire to get rid of the nagging dampness was much stronger. The results of these alterations became apparent literally on the very first frosty winter night. In the morning, families discovered that the corners were no longer covered with a layer of shiny, slippery night ice. The air in the central room was light, and noticeably less firewood than usual had burned in the stove. This practical evidence worked better than any long theoretical debates by the open fire. The stereotypes claiming that only complete air tightness protects against winter crumbled one by one. People realized that for years they had been struggling with the consequences of their own profound architectural misconceptions. The sticky clay, with which the logs had been so carefully caulked, was now used only at the level of the floor and windows. Above the ceiling, they deliberately left a clear wooden space to create the necessary, life-saving draft. This shift in understanding the physics of daily life became a true revolution for the settlers of the Wild West. Construction was no longer the mindless erection of sealed fortresses to protect against freezing weather. It evolved into the conscious management of fresh oxygen flows and excess household moisture. Are you ready to learn exactly what changes carpenters made to frontier house designs after that winter? The boldest frontier, craftsmen began actively experimenting with ventilation in their own homes. They cut small, narrow square windows directly beneath the massive ceiling beams. The result exceeded all expectations within the first 24 hours after the heavy wooden roof was modified. The oppressive dampness dissipated, and the heat from the blazing hearth began to spread in an even, pleasant layer. The optimal size of the new ventilation slit depended on the total area of the specific log house. A rectangular opening that was too large could cool the central room faster than it could warm up. A narrow slit that was too small was completely unable to handle the thick steam from the hot kitchen cauldrons. Local builders had to find the ideal air balance through trial and error over the course of several weeks. Gradually, a rule emerged to create adjustable ventilation gaps at opposite ends of a long roof. Carpenters crafted solid wooden shutters that could slide along smooth guide rails. During heavy snowstorms, these shutters were closed, leaving only a minimal gap for steam to escape slowly. On quiet, frosty nights, they were opened wider, providing a powerful draft of dry, fresh air. This deliberate approach radically changed the very process of constructing a new wooden colonial log house. Carpenters no longer wasted precious time on the perfect fit of the topmost heavy log crowns. They deliberately left construction gaps, carefully shielding them from rain with the overhanging edge of the roof. This design became a kind of engineering standard for an entire generation of Western carpenters. Instead of clay, light wooden lattices made of thin plain boards began to be used under the roof. These lattices broke up the strong gusts of icy wind, preventing them from blowing directly into the room. The airflow broke up into many small streams and gently descended toward the hot stone stove. The cold mixed with the heat, creating the ideal atmosphere for a large family to live in for long periods. Additional vents were even installed in uninhabited attics to protect the wooden floors. A constant draft dried out the roof boards, preventing them from rotting quickly due to moisture buildup. The lifespan of these modernized homes was extended by several decades. The wood remained strong, resonant, and completely dry throughout the long, snowy winter. This architectural technique allowed the settlers to build larger houses without fear of being unable to heat them. A spacious room with proper ventilation was much cozier than a small, airtight box. The heat spread to every corner, creating a comfortable zone across the entire wooden floor. The settlers finally gained confidence in their ability to withstand the harshest western winters. Knowledge of proper air circulation was passed down to young craftsmen as a vital professional secret. A simple crack turned into a complex system of vents, dampers, and guiding ceiling boards. The Wild West was developing its own unique building tradition, dictated by harsh nature and the laws of physics. This experience clearly demonstrated the victory of the flexible human mind over the blind adherence to outdated rules. The constant exchange of dry air radically changed the harsh daily life of people on the distant frontier of civilization. Any wet clothing, after a long day's work outdoors, would dry in a ventilated house in a couple of hours. In the completely airtight old buildings, woolen garments could remain uncomfortably damp for days on end. Dry, clean fabric retained body heat much better during treks through deep snow. Plant provisions dried for the winter kept much longer and more reliably in the new climate. In damp, locked-up houses, flour and valuable grains quickly spoiled, forming a thick, hard crust. Now, cloth sacks of provisions could sit undisturbed in the far corners of a room until spring. This ensured a steady food supply for settler families during long periods of drawn-out snowstorms. Iron tools left in the house overnight no longer became covered with patches of rust. Axes, knives, and metal harness parts remained perfectly dry without constant oiling. The humidity in the air dropped to a level where metal did not undergo a destructive reaction. Tools lasted much longer, saving farmers a tremendous amount of money on the purchase of new blades. People noted how surprisingly easy it was to wake up in the morning in these properly ventilated log homes. Their heads remained clear, and there was no sensation of stagnant, dusty dampness in their throats from the clay walls. The air in the room was always fresh, as if the family were sleeping on an open, frosty plateau under the stars. The quality of their night's rest improved, giving the settlers more strength for the hard physical labor of the day. The women appreciated how quickly the wooden floor dried after the necessary weekly washing of the planks. Before, puddles could sit for hours, soaking into the joints and causing the lower logs of the frame to rot slowly. Now, natural airflow drew the water away in a matter of minutes, leaving the surface completely dry. Keeping the house spotless became much easier and took far less of their valuable time. The smell of smoke and stale sweat had vanished forever from these modernized wooden frontier structures. Vents near the ceiling regularly expelled all unpleasant odors outside, along with the warm, stale air. The house smelled only of fresh, natural wood, dry grasses, and fragrant firewood from the blazing stove. It was pleasant to be inside even during the longest periods of forced snow confinement. Food cooked faster on the open hearth, as the dry oxygen ensured the smoothest possible burn. The flame did not flicker from sudden cold drafts at the bottom, but rose straight up toward the chimney. The cooking process became more predictable and safer for all the inhabitants of this wooden house. The invention of the old mountain hunter gave the colonists a level of stable physical comfort previously unattainable. The settlers' daily lives no longer resembled a daily struggle for basic survival. Properly constructed dwellings became true fortresses, capable of withstanding the onslaught of the harshest winter months. Dry air became humanity's chief ally in the settlement of these vast, unexplored wild territories. The technology required no complex machinery, relying solely on the power of natural processes. The principle of open ventilation gradually became the standard for the construction of wooden colonial dwellings. The architecture of the Wild West began to change rapidly under the influence of this simple physical law of air movement. Houses were universally built with small, specialized wooden vents at the attic and ceiling levels. These neat structural elements were no longer perceived by anyone as a random mistake by an unskilled local carpenter. Air was able to circulate freely just beneath the roof. This radically improved winter comfort for thousands of settler families. The vents were neatly covered with special carved grills to provide reliable protection against large street debris. The airflow passed through them with a soft rustle, which became the most familiar sound of the frontier. Builders no longer wasted precious river clay on caulking the topmost rows of logs. Their hard physical labor became more efficient and focused on creating true, long-lasting comfort. Now they could devote more attention to insulating the wooden floors and the lowest logs of the log cabin. Free air movement solved yet another critically important problem in wooden architecture. Constant ventilation prevented the logs from rotting from the inside due to accumulated household condensation. Previously, black mold often destroyed new homes in just a few harsh winters. Now dry wood lasted for decades without losing any of its natural thermal insulation properties. People's health also improved significantly thanks to the disappearance of harmful fungi on damp walls. Roofs acquired more pronounced overhangs to protect these ventilation gaps from slanting snowfall. Wide eaves diverted falling water far away from wooden walls and open ceiling vents. The visual appearance of the classic settler home became more proportionate, complete, and functionally justified. Every detail of the facade now had a clear physical rationale for the successful functioning of the entire structure. The house acquired its recognizable silhouette, which we often see in historical films. In harsh mountainous regions, such wide roofs served another important protective function. Heavy snowfalls could bury a low hut up to the roof in just one long night. The overhanging eaves created a small protective air pocket near the building's walls. This allowed residents to dig out doors and windows without the risk of massive snow masses collapsing. Nature itself suggested the correct proportions for their new homes to the resourceful colonists. Special rotating wooden boxes appeared, installed on the ridges of large gable roofs. They enhanced draft in calm weather by utilizing the slightest fluctuations in external atmospheric pressure. This system functioned as a natural pump, constantly drawing excess moisture out of the rectangular living rooms. Engineering ingenuity developed the mountain trapper's original idea, refining it to structural perfection. Craftsmen learned to effectively control airflows without any complex mechanical devices. The placement of stoves also changed to account for new knowledge about the direction of indoor air currents. Massive hearths were moved closer to the center of the house to evenly heat the outdoor air descending from above. This arrangement created an ideal thermal barrier, preventing the cold from creeping across the wooden floorboards. The entire interior space became a single zone with a comfortable and absolutely stable, even temperature. The corners of the wooden house no longer froze through and became covered with a thick layer of prickly white frost. The central location of the stove offered another huge advantage during long, dark evenings. Heat radiated in all directions, warming several functional areas inside the spacious hut at once. The family could gather around the fire, mending clothes or preparing hot meals. Precious firewood was used much more sparingly, giving off maximum heat to the living space. This spared the weary people from having to chop extra wood in the bitter winter frosts. Attic spaces, which were previously simply covered with a thick layer of soil, became functional storage areas. A ventilated attic was ideal for storing dry, cured foods and spare clean clothing. The absence of earth fill significantly reduced the load on the supporting wooden ceiling beams. Houses became lighter, more reliable, and required far fewer thick construction logs. Settlers were able to build spacious structures faster and with much less physical effort. The dry, frosty air in the attic served as an ideal natural food preservation chamber. There, bundles of dried apples, sacks of hardy beans, and valuable fur pelts were safely hung. Moisture did not accumulate under the roof at all, so the supplies never spoiled until the long-awaited spring. Proper natural ventilation reliably saved large families from terrible starvation during prolonged snowstorms. The attic became the primary storage place for strategic food reserves for the entire wild frontier. This architectural transition marked the maturation of the entire construction industry in the developing Western territories. Pioneers stopped simply mindlessly copying European designs for stone buildings, adapting them to the local wilderness. They created their own unique style based on rugged practicality and a rigorous understanding of physics. Frontier homes evolved into complex yet incredibly reliable machines for long-term, comfortable living. Settlers finally learned to think in terms of competent survival in harsh wild conditions. The new architecture reflected the unbroken spirit of independence and resourcefulness of the people who conquered these vast expanses. They learned to listen to nature, use its eternal laws to their advantage, and improve their way of life. The genius of this technical solution lay in its absolute simplicity and maximum efficiency without unnecessary details. This experience proved that careful observation of the world is valued far more highly than blind physical perseverance. People
We
stopped
finally made it,
desperately
Kaj.
fighting the elements and
This is
began to
ours
wisely
now.
harness their immense power for their own benefit. The story of a strange wooden mountain cabin vividly illustrates the hidden power of natural human observation. The old experienced trapper had no formal engineering education, but he understood the laws of wild physics perfectly. He knew for certain that invisible moisture is the main enemy of heat in conditions of extremely low temperatures. His unconventional spatial thinking allowed him to turn the icy wind into a reliable and completely free ally. He simply used the cold outdoor air to dry out his dwelling, saving himself from certain death. This savvy approach was fundamentally different from the colonists' head-on struggle against the harsh environment. Massive, desperate attempts to seal themselves off from the world with thick walls inevitably led to the creation of a damp trap.
It truly is.
The wisdom of the simple
safe
loner
now.
lay in harnessing the forces of winter to solve everyday problems. A small, controlled gap under the ceiling quickly solved a problem that even huge piles of burning firewood couldn't handle. Heat was no longer wasted on the futile task of heating wet, heavy wood. The physics of this life-saving historical process was ingeniously simple and worked flawlessly. Warm air from people's frequent breathing and the boiling pot always rose to the very highest ceiling. It carried a huge amount of water vapor, which had previously settled as icy droplets on the cold walls. Now this dangerous, damp vapor was drawn unhindered to the outside through specially left ventilation gaps. The wooden house remained dry and thus incredibly warm even on the harshest January nights. The legacy of this basic principle still lives on in the traditional architecture of many Western forest states. Modern, high-tech home ventilation systems operate according to the same unchanging physical laws of air movement. A precise understanding of the properties of dry and humid outdoor air saved many pioneers from certain freezing. Frontier experience proved that sometimes to retain heat, you simply need to open the top window slightly. This rule seems very paradoxical, but it is precisely what saved thousands of lives. Modern builders often forget this simple truth, relying on high-powered artificial heaters and air conditioners. They create completely sealed plastic and concrete boxes, entirely devoid of natural, free-flowing air. As a result, people have to spend enormous amounts of electricity on dehumidifying and purifying the heavy indoor air. Drawing on the rich historical experience of pioneers could easily solve many of the problems of modern residential energy consumption. Artificial climate control often makes our modern homes much less healthy for permanent residents. A complete disregard for the old laws of ventilation today often leads to what is known as sick building syndrome. Moisture accumulates unnoticed inside airtight walls, causing hidden damage and severe allergic reactions in residents. Mountain hunters intuitively avoided this terrible fate by trusting the simple movement of the frosty wind. Their modest structures breathe easily in harmony with the surrounding forest, constantly renewing their internal atmosphere. This time-tested ancient approach to the microclimate deserves the deepest respect from modern engineers. A mountain dweller's hut is a perfect example of the harmonious coexistence of a simple structure and the surrounding wilderness. It did not disrupt the balance at all, but rather integrated into it, using natural cold currents to maintain stability. It was a true triumph of common sense over the primal fear of the low temperatures of the winter plains. People capable of noticing such subtle connections became true pioneers in the exploration of this vast continent. They established entirely new rules of survival for future generations of intrepid Western settlers. Peering at the old weathered logs of surviving Western cabins, one can notice these structural details. The vents under the roof stand as silent monuments to the human ingenuity and engineering ingenuity of ordinary workers. They are a constant reminder of a time when survival depended directly on a person's ability to understand the world around them. This invaluable knowledge was gained under harsh conditions of snowstorms, biting winds, and endless long nights. Ancient wisdom is forever frozen in the wood, continuing to reliably guard the secrets of true, living warmth. Studying such historical construction details allows us to better understand the very nature of the settlement of the Wild West. It was an era not only of conflict, but also of amazing technological innovations under the most extreme conditions. The wisdom of the frontier lies in the ability to see non-obvious solutions where others see only insurmountable obstacles. This fundamental life principle remains relevant and in demand in any historical era. What do you think of this ventilation method? Suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos.